Welcome, welcome, my friends. I'm your host, Jared Bowman, and this is Biblically Speaking, your program for looking at the truth of God's Word. And tonight, we're going to be taking a pause from our series of evidences and asking ourselves a question before we go much deeper into them, and that is, why are we talking about it? Why do we need to know these things? Why do we need to have these discussions? Why do we need to address things like the age of the earth and creation and the age of the universe? And in part, why do these things seem as old as they do? Now, I freely admit, based on last week's episode on the dinosaurs, that there are lots of things that seem older than they actually are when you actually look at sort of the truth of carbon dating and uranium isotope decay and things like that. That a lot of what man offers as evidence for the age of the earth and the age of the universe just don't hold up. But the reality is that the universe still appears to be a very old place. And part of that, I would say to you, is simply the necessity of having an expanding universe that, even though we would like to be able to trace it all the way back to its beginnings, that God probably created an old universe in the process of being old. Just like he created animals that were capable of reproducing after its kind, he created a universe that was old enough to hold itself together by material or by the principles of physics and by the laws of physics, that he did not create something that was still in the process of creation. And that's very important for us to understand, because sometimes we do run into things that appear to be evidence that the universe is far older than what we would say that it is. And that shouldn't be a challenge to our faith, because we understand that God created man and gave him the directive to be fruitful and multiply. He created animals with the capability of doing that. He created trees that were fully grown. He can create a universe that is full grown. So it really shouldn't be a challenge to our faith at all. But I want to get back to this question of, why do we need to talk about these things? And it really comes down to this. In 1 Peter chapter 3, beginning in verse 13, the Bible says, "Who is there to harm you if you prove zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed. And do not fear their intimidation, and do not be troubled, but sanctify Christ as Lord in your heart, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence." When you look at that, the idea of being ready to answer the challenges of men for our faith, why we stubbornly hang on to these things that the world looks at and say they are intangible religious arguments, and yet we continue to argue for a very real view, a very certain, better way of saying it, very certain view of a creator. So even though our universe might sometimes appear to be very old, it would make sense that God would create it so. Just like he could use the flood to reshape the world, to cleanse the world of the sin of man and wipe out the violence that had become a part of his creation, it would make sense that he would create a universe at a point that we would see it operating in appearance under its own physical laws, or the laws of physics. And yet, what's interesting about this is science will say that there has always been this schism between religion and science, that the two have always been at odds with one another. And yet, that's not the case. I've been reading a great book. I'm going to put a link to it in the description. It's an Amazon affiliate link. The program gets a little credit if you click on it, you decide to buy it or buy something else on Amazon. You get a little credit for it. So thank you if you do that. But it's a link to a book by Stephen Meyer called The Return of the God Hypothesis. And I have been devouring this book lately. I absolutely love it. In fact, next week's program is going to feature a lot of things from that. And I'm just throwing this out there because he happens, I think, to live in the Seattle area. If anybody knows Stephen Meyer, I would love to interview him for either this web series or a podcast, the Man Up podcast, which just started, by the way. Episode 2 drops tonight, so be watching for that. But I would love to interview him because this man's a deep thinker, and his attitude is not to be confrontational with those who question the idea of intelligent design, but to show that when you get all the way to the end of whether it's the Big Bang or quantum mechanics or quantum physics rather, or you get all the way down to the theory of an expanding universe with the force of expansion pulling it along, It all comes back to one very fundamental question: what came before? And until we can really answer that question, we're just tilting at windmills. We might solve a lot of complex math along the way, but we're just tilting at windmills until we can stop and answer the big questions. There are things that we're going to talk about in coming weeks, but how did helium and hydrogen form from plasma? And that out of those elements, how did things like carbon 12 form, which is the fundamental building block of life? And we leap over that question. And we leap over the question of the fact that we do see order in the universe in the form of Newton's rudimentary gravity equation, or Einstein's cosmological constant, or the theory of general relativity that explains how mass can bend time and light, and all of those things. There are big questions in there that we just ignore so that we can continue to work out a math that proves that you don't need a creator. And yet, when you delve into those questions, when you ask yourself, how did DNA information get written on proteins made of carbon being formed in hostile environments without the structure of a cell to protect it? How did that information first get written in there and repeated over many proteins, stringing together to make a life form when we can't replicate that today? We can draw a tree that says this animal came from this animal, and we can tilt at windmills and say, well, obviously abiogenesis requires there to be this kind of environment, but we cannot replicate it. We just can't. Science skips over the question of where are the missing links between the higher level species, and why, when you have a mass extinction event, do we start over with the highest level of species in the fossil record and not the lowest level of species? You would think that if in a hostile environment where the climate had sort of been reset, the atmosphere had degenerated into a lower form of itself, that you would see everything needing to start over again with primordial buildings of proteins and single-celled animals. And yet that's not what we see. And increasingly, those kinds of questions are ignored because they don't have an answer. And yet, people that actually do study things like the Big Bang, there are a number of them, Christian apologists. These are people who say, at the end of it all, there has to be an intelligence behind it because there is order. And this idea that we're just perceiving order, that's not the case. Look at the book that I told you. Go buy a copy of this book. Read it. You have Nobel Prize winning scientists who are saying the order is really there. The necessity for something to have taught DNA how to write information is there. The necessity for a causal event outside of a singularity that's an infinite point of smallness containing all mass, all matter, all energy that would ever exist in the universe, which makes really no sense at all. But outside of that singularity, there had to be something that brought order to our universe, or else it wouldn't exist the way that it is, because probability is against it. And until we're ready to say that confidently, until we're ready to tell our kids, look, I'm not telling you that science cannot provide some answers to the laws that God used to create the universe, but God is still the only answer that explains its origin. Until we're ready to say that without fear, and in fact pin our hopes to it, we're going to continue to feel like our backs are against the wall and we're not sure how we're going to give an answer. And brothers and sisters, that is not a way that we should feel. We have a great consolation of hope. When John talked about creation, he said Jesus was the creator. When Paul wrote to the church at Rome, and he told them that he is not ashamed of the gospel of Christ because it's the power of God to salvation to all who believe, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed, from faith unto faith. The righteous man shall live by faith. He wrote that to them. He wanted them to understand there is a coming judgment. For the wrath of God, verse 18, is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And in a lot of ways, that's what we're engaged in academically, is an attempt to suppress the truth, that we see evidence of God and we skip over the things that would help us to see God and go and continue working the math as if he doesn't exist. We're suppressing God. We're suppressing his righteousness. We're suppressing his truth. Well, why are we doing that? Because that which is known about God is evident within them. Verse 19. For God made it evident, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. So, what Paul is saying is that God is the creator, he is the cause of everything in the universe, and through what he has created, we learn about him. Well, what do we learn? Well, think about the story of Noah and the flood again. We talked about that last week on the program. What did we learn about God? Well, we learned that God can judge, and God judges like a creator. We learned that God is faithful, that he kept his promise to Noah. And I love that image of God closing the door of the ark as if to say, these people are now in my care. We learned that God expects obedience as part of righteousness. And we learned that God is not afraid to make promises that he will keep. That's the reason that I have hope. And that's the reason that you should have hope. And that's the reason why we need to be looking at these kinds of things and asking these questions, because people want to know, if there's so much scientific evidence that says that God doesn't exist, then why do you persist in that hope? I'm reminded of the thought of Richard Dawkins, who said, when you get to the bottom of it all, what we see is a universe exactly as it would have to be. That there was no, in his mind, evidence of a designer, evidence of a creator. And he explained that it is an indifferent, almost hostile place to everyone. Well, why do they come to that conclusion? Because if there's no God, there's no hope. But as I said before, science is not inherently anti-God. I want to give you 3 names. I want you to go learn about them before next week. They are Robert Boyle, Isaac Newton, and Johannes Kepler. You know what those 3 men have in common? They are all well-respected men of science. Robert Boyle is considered the father of modern chemistry. He's the guy that came up with Boyle's gas laws about how gas behaves under heat and pressure. Johannes Kepler, alongside Copernicus, is considered the father of modern cosmology. He actually came up with the rules for planetary motion, and I believe he was the guy who originally deduced that planets traveled in an elliptical motion. Isaac Newton is the man who is the father of modern physics. Now, he got a lot wrong about the universe. He believed that the universe was held in a constant state of equilibrium, kind of by infinite gravity and infinite mass, and that the two held each other in check. But he came up with the simple expression of gravity, an equation that we still use today, that F, the force of gravity, equals G, the gravity constant, times the mass of one thing times the mass of another over the distance squared, which is an equation that I learned in high school physics to calculate gravity. We're still using the work of these men. And do you know what all 3 of them had in common? They all believed that by their work, they better understood the mind of God. Because in their observation, they didn't see that the evidence for God was lacking. They saw more than abundant evidence for God. And it wasn't until guys like Charles Lyell, with his theory of uniformitarianism, or Charles Darwin, who took Lyell's theory of a very old Earth and ran with it into the explosion of Darwinism, which is not even Darwinian evolution as we understand it today. We believe in something called neo-Darwinism that's even more complicated and foolish than Darwin was. It wasn't until people like that got involved that God was really removed from the equation. And God was really an accepted part of science until you had people like Hume and Freud and Marx become involved with it, not from the standpoint of science at all, but from the standpoint of philosophy. Because that cold indifference that Richard Dawkins loved to talk so much about isn't really science at all. It's a statement of philosophy. And in many times, that's what's masquerading as true science. It is a philosophy of not wanting to see God, so we ignore the questions that point to God. And you probably noticed that in some of the atheist comments that have been made on these videos. Nobody ever offers any hard science. Nobody's even willing to debate me on those things. Nobody is willing to contend with the evidence that guys like Stephen Meyer or David Galertner offer up for the intelligent design. But instead, what we see over and over again is the philosophy of materialism that does not want to listen to God. Well, it is that philosophy that is at the root of these programs. Because you see, brothers and sisters, friends and neighbors, I believe that we have a hope. And I believe that hope is evidenced in God's power to not only create, but hold this universe together. And so as we go to the deep end and as we start talking about these more complex things over the next few weeks, I want you to remember two things. Number one, I'm going to make it as simple as I can because that's what I want you to do. I want you to understand it so you can ask the questions about it. But number two, every one of these questions are questions that when you put them back to them, they cannot answer. Because they're the questions that they skip over because they're inconvenient. And an inconvenient question is the one that we need to answer first. Well, that's all I have for you tonight. It was a short program, I know. But until I see you again, I want to say this. Have a good day, and God bless.